Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. While resource wealth is supposed to make countries rise and flourish, that's often not the case. Some of the most resource wealthy nations are also the ones that are struggling the most. This has led many to believe in the resource curse, or the paradox of the plenty, where more resources lead to more problems with the economy, governance, and peace. Let's take a look at this in detail with our panel of experts. Joining us today is Mr. Saeed Khan, who's a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit. He joins us from Detroit. Also joining us is Mr. Rajiv Biswas, who is an economist and senior director at the Asia Pacific Chief Economist. He joins us from Singapore, and Mercy Abang, who's a journalist, joining us from Berlin. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Biswas, now, when you look at the state of many of these economies all across the world who are rich with resources, would you say that most of them are struggling? Is that the case that we could perhaps generalize?
Many developing countries with large mineral resources, such as oil-rich countries or countries with large mineral resources in other minerals such as iron ore or base metals, seem to have a track record of considerable economic difficulties. And I think part of the issue is around corporate governance topics. You know, the way the nation is governed is not always, to high standards. And so that's part of the problem. But also, I think there's a fundamental issue of what's called the Dutch disease in economic parlance. Economists refer to Dutch disease as the impact of having very large inflows of money from sale of commodities, and that drives up the exchange rate and creates a lot of imbalances in the economy. So I think part of the problem is also related to this economic structural issue of what's called the Dutch disease, the disease of affluence, if you like, from having too much money coming in. And often what you find in developing countries is when they have large inflows of money from commodities, some of these governments invest heavily in certain projects, white elephant projects that are, a waste of the resources. I think some of the wiser countries, the ones who have done better, have put some of that money into long-term sovereign wealth funds.
Mr. Biswas, hold on to that thought. I want to talk about the exceptions to we're talking about the exceptions to the resource curse. But just before that, I want to jump to Mr. Khan and talk to him about some of the historical factors which might lead to the problem in governance, as Mr. Biswas talked about. Now, when we see many of these developing economies, they have a historical background of being colonized, many other factors that come with it, interference within their governments. How do you think that plays into having a weak government infrastructure?
It's played perhaps the most significant role, and I'm glad that you're raising the issue of history, particularly colonial history. I mean, if we go back to the 15th century and early 16th century, when you see the Iberian countries make their way into the Americas and plunder the peoples of these societies, particularly for gold and silver, and how the influx of that then massively changed the destiny of not only Europeans, the European economic system, but also the plight and the fate of those countries which then became susceptible to colonization. Now, at the same time, it's also important to recognize that with colonization came two other very important accompanying factors. One was the shift in economic models from what had been primarily a barter system to one that now was trading with currency. currency. Well, of course, if the influx of the currency is now gold and silver that has been plundered and brought back to Europe, Europe is going to have a decisive advantage. And the other issue, of course, is industrialization. And as particularly Europe and Western countries recognize the need for natural resources that they themselves did not have, whether that was rubber or whether that was any number of other things which they found in abundance with other countries, they were able to then exploit that and colonize, both in order to monopolize goods, but also to create new markets and to prevent others from coming there. So now when people talk about developing countries and their inability to marshal and control their resources, we find that it's a rather cynical approach, given the inability that these countries have had to even develop on their own.
Right. Biswas, we were talking about the exceptions to this resource curse amongst these developing colonized nations. Do we see any examples, shining examples, in which they were able to beat this infrastructure that they inherited, and they were able to take and exploit and the full use and potential of their resources?
Well, I think if we look in the Middle East, you can find some good examples of countries that have used their oil wealth in a good way, particularly the United Arab Emirates. If you look at Abu Dhabi and Dubai, what you see is that their initial rise due to oil wealth has been invested heavily back into the country to try to diversify the economy and create other sources of long-term growth. Such as creating free trade zones, which are now kind of platform for global multinationals to trade with the Middle East region and also with Africa. And also, I think, the development of tourism has been very successful. The development of the UAE as a logistics hub for the whole region, for aviation, for shipping, and trade. So I think for me that is one of the positive examples.
Right. Mercy, I'm going to jump to you now. Biswas brought up oil here, and he talked to that in relation to the UAE and how he sees that as a rising example. Now, you've, of course, reported from Nigeria for a very, very long time. How has oil as a resource impacted the society and its growth and development?
I mean, that's an interesting question. In terms of the management of our oil resources, especially in a country like Nigeria, I wouldn't give it a pass mark, given the fact that even the oil itself is still not refined back home. There's been conversation for a very long time. Successive governments keep promising that, all the refineries are going to be functional and operating in capacities where they can refine the kind of products that would be enough for even Nigeria to consume. But that is still not going on. Nigeria is still importing a large sum of oil that is going into various forms. There's what they call the subsidy, which is still there's lots of questions around the subsidy regime on its own. Lots of resources allocated to that subsidy on its own. And this government at the moment did promise that they were going to take that out, but that has not been done. Now, if we're going to have a country or an economy that has to invest in infrastructural development, human capital development, and we're still appropriating trillions and trillions of dollars yearly just to make sure that the subsidy regime, which feeds into the oil that is the refined product that is being imported back into the country, it makes a mockery of all of it. Yes, the conversation around resource curse started in the 50s. That's about the same time that Nigeria found oil. So if we're being accountable as a country, we would have sat down to say, how about we ensure that this oil can be refined here and our people can get jobs, we can use some of this. We wouldn't have been having the conversations around subsidy for oil. The subsidy regime is coming because people have to import the refined product back home. And the monies that is being spent to import all of this should have been spent in other sectors of the economy.
Right. Mercy, now you paint a very, of course, a complex picture of what is a complex situation. Mr. Khan, now we talked a little about the historical factors that lead to weak infrastructures that aren't able to implement the best forms of governance. But when we take a look at modern history, what role has oil played as being a curse for many places, a resource which can be exploited for many other factors? How do you see this?
Well, oil is part of what Daniel Yergin called in his wonderful biography of oil the prize. And we find that particularly since the early 20th century, this has been part of the great game where Western powers have swooped into countries, not just in the Middle East, but as Mercy said, of course, also Nigeria. Venezuela is another great example of this process. And what we find then is two different trajectories. One is the installation of quiescent governments and regimes which will do the bidding of whether it is sovereign states or corporations, or the flat-out exploitation of these countries for their wealth. The two best examples are Iraq and Iran. Back in the 1920s, an Armenian arms dealer by the name of Kanusti Gulbenkian brokered the deal for oil in Iraq. He was known as Mr. 5% because that was his commission. But the oil of Iraq belonged in equal proportion to four countries, Britain, France, the United States, and the Netherlands. The Iraqis only got royalties. They didn't get ownership. And the same thing happened with Iran, with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation, which of course then led to the nationalization of the oil industry by Mohammad Mossadegh in 1951, and then the subsequent ouster of Mossadegh by the CIA and MI6 in 1953. So we find then that this is a rather checkered history for many of these countries. It is what Fareed Zakaria calls the establishment of trust fund regimes. Those like the UAE, like what Rajiv mentioned, the rest of the Gulf states, where we find that it is a single commodity resource that upon which the economy is based, which is utterly controlled by external forces.
Right. You mentioned, Mr. Khan, along with the examples of Iraq and Iran, you also mentioned Venezuela. Now, Venezuela has the largest reserves of oil in the world. And with that, we see that the economy is very turbulent. Going back, and especially after the period from the Cold War, during the Cold War, how do you see that resource making the state vulnerable?
Well, you find the vulnerability, Michelle, comes from the efforts of the state to gain autonomy and agency over their own natural resource. And in the case of Venezuela, this was done by Hugo Chavez, who nationalized the oil industry and said that this, because it is a national commodity, it really is for the Venezuelans, not for external factors and entities to decide how it's distributed, how it's sold, how it's even processed. And of course, it wasn't just the resource curse. For many, this was seen as a resource crime. The audacity of Venezuela to actually have agency over its own national commodity. And efforts have been made really since Chavez to try to then bring down the economy of Venezuela, to try to exploit it. And we see even currently with the whole issue regarding Maduro, this is really at its very fundamental level about oil, about trying to push back on Venezuela, imposing embargoes and other economic sanctions to essentially bring it to its knees.
Right. Mr. Rajiv, now, I earlier said that we were going to talk about the exceptions to this rule, and I want to touch upon that, but I also want to talk about the place you're talking to us from, Singapore. Now, Singapore doesn't have a lot of natural resources, and it has excelled pretty well. It's done pretty well for itself. When we talk about this, it seems like it breaks the concept that natural resources are important also for development.
I think a lot of this is about governance. So, why do some countries with huge mineral endowments fail to succeed in their development? It's because governance in many of these countries is very poor. In the case of Singapore, it's the opposite. They don't have commodity resources, yet they've been extremely successful. When Singapore became an independent country from the UK, it was a very poor country, and the standard of living was really very low. But yet it has now become the richest nation in Asia without any natural resources. And it's, I think, fundamentally about good governance and sound economic management. And most importantly, I think that the government understood the importance of having strategic industries that were going to drive economic growth in the long term. And I think when we look at that model and then compare it to what has happened in some of these quite wealthy, oil-rich countries or other mineral-rich countries who got a lot of, inflows of money from their huge exports of minerals, they wasted the money. They didn't invest in economic diversification.
Right.
They didn't have strategic plans how to diversify their economy, and they squandered their wealth.
Mr. Rajiv Biswas, on that point of diversification, do you feel like lessons are being learned and there is this realization that relying on one resource is just not going to take you through?
I think governments are understanding that they need to diversify, but they're not able to really implement it. If we really look at the countries in the developing world, it's really only Asia which has successfully diversified out of being mineral or agricultural dependent economies into industrial economies. If you look at much of the Middle East, most of sub-Saharan Africa, and also most of Latin America, they're still heavily dependent on either agriculture or minerals, and they haven't managed to diversify after decades and decades of effort. So, I would say most developing countries have really failed to
do that.
Move away from their resource dependence.
Right. And Mercy, let's talk to you about your specific context, your specific case. What were the social blockades? What continue to be the main social blockades? We talked about bad governance and corruption, but other things that are more entrenched in the system that prevent the economy from diversifying.
Like what the last speaker rightly pointed out. Look at Singapore, for instance. There's a need for an intentional leadership. That's what I would call it, because this conversation has gone on for as long as I can long as I was born, and it's always almost always the same thing. For a country like Nigeria, it's almost the dependence on oil is so embarrassing at this point that when there's a crisis between the United States and Iraq, you literally see Nigerian government officials getting excited, and the conversation is that the oil price will go up. And I'm always in shock, like, why economy because of a two-faced disagreement over two nations, right? Of course, the oil prices goes up. Cited that your dependency is not certain. There's no guarantee. Oil is not even as attractive or as lucrative as it used to be. But we still have governments that are only excited about the number of the prices as it goes up. That shows you that a leadership crisis. We have a crisis of constitutes. We have leaders that are the vision of the country. So if we have about an estimated 200 million people in Nigeria, that tells you that we have an unproductive young population. Nigeria is a country with millions about the youngest continent, constitutes youngest population of people in Africa.
Right, and that's a great resource to have. And if not exploiting that of course is a tragedy and something that's happening all across the developing world with lack of access to educational reforms, other social reforms that can lead to exploiting the youth's potential. Mr. Saeed Khan, I want to go back to a point. We were talking about colonization. Now, there has been a recent movement or discussion in many parts of the developing world where they ask for apologies from former colonizers to at least acknowledge what they did. But a part of that apology is also making them realize that the plunder they did then and there continues to impact the economy now. Take us through that. How does that happen? Now, Utsa Patnaik, who is an economist, recently stated that India was plundered to the extent of $45 trillion during the period of 1765 to 1938. What kind of impact and legacy does that leave behind?
These are huge debates that are occurring right now. I mean, not just at the Oxford Union, but also in other spaces. And I think that they're important discussions to have because for countries, particularly the so-called developed countries, to look with a certain level of condescension, to look with a certain level of patronization at countries and saying, well, how come you're not better? And why have you not really developed? Is, again, a very cynical approach, given the fact that not only did the cause of their retarded development land firmly on the policies that were made in Western capitals, but at the same time, it was what made those Western capitals prosperous. Great Britain without India, Great Britain without Nigeria, Great Britain without Singapore would not be great. And so there needs to be that recognition. Now, the idea of the British being able to pay back $45 trillion to India, and then on top of that, also when invoices come from the rest of the British colonial enterprise, Great Britain will wish to come back into the European Union, I'm sure, for the bailout. But at least when it comes to having commercial transactions with these countries, there can be the hope for, at the very least, a certain level of equitable transaction, or perhaps even more ideally, recognizing the impact of colonization on these countries and providing more benefits for those countries which had been adversely impacted by their policies within the last 200 years.
Right. Mr. Rajiv Biswas, this equitable transaction that Mr. Saeed Khan talks about, one way of not, of course, at any way being able to undo the damage that has been done, but at least move forward in the right way. What reforms at an international level can exist in order to move towards more equitable transactions?
I think the self-interests of the former colonial powers will make it very difficult to find any kind of, level playing field in terms of countries, say in Europe, acknowledging, their past failures. I don't think that's in the culture or mentality of Europe to do that. So I think where equity will come is by developing countries getting much more leverage through their growing economic might, because developing countries are a much bigger share of the world economy. They're sovereign states. There's some very big developing countries like China, India, Brazil, which are now big players on the global stage, forcing that kind of more equitable relationship through institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, where their economic weight forces developed countries to acknowledge that they're dealing with equal partners. I think that is where we are right now. I don't think willingly the former, colonial powers will relinquish their leverage. It has to be taken by economic strength.
Right. And do you see any future hope of that being happening, that the way you're describing it, that actually being done?
I think it is happening. I think it's happening because the economic strength of these developing countries are forcing that to happen. I mean, the rise of China in the last 15 years has been fundamental to that changing balance. I think in future, the increasing weight of countries like India, Indonesia, and also developing countries in Latin America and Africa as well are going to gradually shift that balance. But they're up against quite strong forces of neocolonialism. And I think that's something that developing countries really need to understand, that, you know, they're not just being welcomed with open arms by the developed countries. It's a struggle for power.
Right.
It's a geopolitical struggle between developing countries and developed countries. And developing countries have to have a much more concerted approach to getting some of that negotiating power back.
Right, on that point, thank you so much, Mr. Rajiv Biswas, for joining us from Singapore, Mr. Saeed Khan for joining us from Detroit, and Mercy Abang for joining us from Berlin. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we continue our discussion about the resource curse, now joining us is Mr. Robert Oulds, who's the director of the UK think tank, the Bruce Group, joining us from London. Also joining us is Rosemary Enemuo, who is an analyst, joining us from Lagos. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Oulds, now we've been talking a lot about the historical factors that have led to what we see many countries not being able to exploit their resources, but in fact, the resources dragging them down. Now, do you feel like it's inevitable that this resource curse will exist?
Countries that produce the most oil in the world, amongst the most, the United States and China, are certainly not cursed by their resources, because they have at the moment the two largest economies on the world. In reality, the resource curse is something of a myth and even an excuse for allowing or justifying poor governance and letting the actual issues of corruption, nepotism, a failure to invest in the economy and a failure to actually have a real growing economy, just blaming this on the resource curse, which is really a myth. Actually, resources would benefit and a boom, just as they are to countries like Norway, which is a major oil exporter, and yet it is a growing country and has amongst the highest foreign direct investment in Europe, even when you take out the investment in the oil industry. So it doesn't have to be a curse. What people need to do is actually focus on their politicians and where they're failing them.
Right. Now, this is one of the hot topics that we were discussing in the previous segment, which was that many of the countries have a historical baggage with them, especially when we look at the case of Venezuela, which has the largest amount of oil reserves in the world and is unable to move towards economic growth. In fact, what we've been seeing in the past year has been great economic turbulence. Now, how would you factor those into this discussion, those historical roots that take place, whether foreign intervention, colonization, and many of what caused this weak form of governance to exist?
Well, Venezuela did have a very successful economy until Hugo Chavez was elected. Of course, previously he had tried to take power in a coup. He was democratically elected eventually, but it was a growing economy until Chavez took over. And then, of course, he was succeeded when he passed away by Maduro. And they followed the path of socialism, thought they could live off their oil rather than have a properly functioning, growing economy. And that's where things went wrong. This is purely a result, and not of their oil, which is a major boom, or would be, to the Venezuelan economy because they have such substantial reserves. The problem is their politicians that have taken power, rule through autocratic means, have inherent corruption to keep the armed forces on so that Maduro would stay in power. Of course, he has a lot of support and won't be overthrown anytime soon. That has been quite clear from the protests and the actions of international governments to get rid of him. But the fact remains that Venezuela's problems rest with their politicians and the corruption which exists to keep the regime in.
Right. Mr. Oulds, stay with me. Now, I want to jump to Rosemary on this. Rosemary, now there have been a lot of international measures being taken place in order to fight this very corruption that Mr. Oulds talks about. How much of a success do you think they've had and impact they've had on many places all around the world, even from the one you're speaking to us from right now?
All right, thank you. So I'd say that, first of all, having transparent groups and transparent operation does not necessarily have impact. on the research course. Like Mr. Robert said earlier, that is a myth. I also support that it's also a myth. I think more of the problem is on institutional weakness, political problems like management of resources, diversification. So it's all the operations they've had and all the meetings and all the bodies they've been able to create to solve this problem hasn't done so much, because in Nigeria, the oil is still one of the biggest sector of the country. And of course, we have shocks when it comes to boom and bust. It affects commodity prices. It affects normal relations, conflict. So there's not really much impact, like I would say. Not really much impact.
Right. Mr. Oulds, now talking about what more can be done on an international scale specifically, we have talked about the problem here, poor governance, corruption. What can be done to fight all of this?
Well, there needs to be people holding their governments to account. There needs to be a cultural change. But economically, China is a country that has a lot of corruption. It still has a growing economy because, of course, the way to actually produce real economic growth is not through exporting raw materials, be that products mined in Australia, which still has a growing economy, or exporting oil or gas. The answer is the real way that wealth is created is to turn those products into actual manufactures and things that can be used at the downstream. So really, these oil-producing countries, or these countries that are rich in natural resources, should be making sure that instead of just exporting their product, the real money, the real way to create jobs and have real economic growth, and of course increase those important GDP figures and get the economy moving, is to have the downstream production. That's where the wealth comes from, the oil, not from the exportation of the oil. And this can be done. Brazil was a good example. It is a very resource-rich country. It has oil, it has a whole host of resources, yet it's still managed, until, of course, the crash over a decade ago now, to have one of the largest small airplane manufacturing industries in existence, which is something that uses a lot of resources. It is possible to take a country's resources and say, we are going to manufacture at home. We are going to create a business environment that will create wealth. And
this is also a point that was, sorry to interrupt you there. This was also a point brought up before, that there isn't much of a rule book for fair trade all across, equitable transaction all across the board, especially when we talk about these superpowers, how they force developing nations to sell products at lower cost, all of this happening. Now, what do you think can be done about that? And do you see something really happening when the practicality of this, speaks that those in power will continue to exert force?
Countries or economic blocs such as the European Union should open up their markets. They should end the protectionism, which is actually damaging to those who practice the protectionism. They should open up their markets to developing nations. Britain leaving the European Union, as it will do on Friday, will hopefully have a trade policy going forward into the long run where we open up our market in the UK to the services, the goods, even the agricultural produce of developing nations, countries around the world we've always had traditionally links with that we gave up to join the European Union. So that will be a step in the right direction from what is still a significant country, the UK, in economic terms. Of course, America will, of course, open up its trade more so, if indeed that is respected by other countries. And that's the way we need to go. We need to have opening up our markets, and we have to have free trade across the globe, but that must be reciprocated. There must be some degree of countries, developing nations, being willing to protect international property rights, to protect intellectual property as well, make sure that their economies are open and that corruption is tackled. And we will hopefully see Western countries, Western power blocs reciprocate. There needs to be fairness across the board. And you are absolutely right when the focus should rest on each country or blocs like the European Union and the major economy in the world, which is the United States, which is in some degree protectionist and has the luxury of being so because it has so much resources at home. But there needs to be a real effort to open up trade, because that is the way to lift people out of poverty.
Right. Rosemary, now we've been talking international solutions or international policies that can work, but of course we know that in any context it's important to have homegrown solutions, those that take into the history into account, the specific context of that region into account. Do you see anything working in this regard, specifically in Nigeria, homegrown solutions which are fighting the system to become more transparent?
Yes, I do. Okay, I support international initiative, which is good, but so little can be done. Let's take, for example, privatization. There are some industries that are better privatized for growth to take place so that resources can be measurable. Apart from measurable, it can diversify and grow other sectors of the economy. So if we don't have privatization, which can be scrutinized and regulated by the government, would never grow. Imagine a public sector where nobody checks. You don't check because people don't pay so much tax, so you're not forced to be accountable to your government. But when it's privatized and there's tax, there's less subsidy for oil, there's less subsidy for dollar, there's less subsidy for other things. It doesn't affect production at home. I think there will be measurable growth.
Right. On that point, thank you much, Rosemary and Enemuo, for joining us and talking to us. Mr. Oulds, now another dimension to this resource curse. You, of course, state that it is a myth, but when we do see countries which are rich in resources unable to move towards economic growth, one of the reasons for that is also that they are conflict-stricken. How do you factor that into this entire notion that this is, of course, a myth, when many of these countries are in conflict precisely for being rich in their resources?
The Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire, in Africa is a great example where there have been conflicts. Other nations have got involved, where they're trying to take over the mineral wealth that exists, which is being demanded so heavily by the West. But this is not always the case. We know of countries around the globe that have very rich in resources that are at peace. So it really is a matter that this is sort of just coincidental in many cases, apart from, of course, the example that I gave about Congo. But one of the main ways which is causing the problems is actually efforts to alleviate the poverty. There is a case that can be made that actually Western aid is actually leading to a misallocation of resources, and the best and the brightest in a developing nation are then getting jobs administering aid, which in many cases not actually required. And it diverts the best and the brightest, it diverts the money, and it leads people to not focus on producing wealth and goods which can be exported or even used in a domestic market. So if the
Mr.
West
really stay with me on that point. Stay with me on that. I want to introduce another guest who's just joined us, Mr. Joseph Cheng, who's an analyst from Hong Kong. Mr. Cheng, you must be listening at least some part of the conversation that's been ongoing with Mr. Oulds. Now, he has put forth the fact that put forth the notion that it's coincidental when we see many rich, resourced countries being struck with conflict. Earlier, we did discuss specific examples in which, for instance, Iraq, Iran, all these places serve as examples where their resources become a curse specifically because they bring about so much attention. Do you agree with Mr. Robert Oulds' assessment that it's a coincidence that conflict breaks out where countries are rich with resources?
I do believe that they are mainly coincidences, but there are so many cases that people make generalizations. For example, we observe that many big lottery winners soon spend their wealth. And the Chinese also have a saying that wealth may not last for more than 3 generations. But actually, if resource-rich countries plan well, and if they spend their money wisely, using the money to set up a fund, to tide over economic difficulties, to enhance productivity, to invest other sources of income, other sources of economic growth, they can do well.
Right. So you, Mr. Cheng, you also agree with Mr. there that it is a coincidence that many of these countries are stuck between conflict because of their resources?
I guess so. The problems arise mainly because of corruption, because of ill management, lack of planning, extravagance, and these factors may seriously affect a country's development with or without resources. We also observe that it does not have to do much with the political systems. Norway is a resource-rich country, and a very liberal democratic country. It certainly has been using its wealth very well. And almost all Persian Gulf states have been using their wealth quite well. And they are absolute monarchies without democratic reforms. So,
right, Mr. Cheng, since we're running short on time, I do want to get to the point of Hong Kong and where you're talking to us from. Now, of course, it serves as an example, a place with fewer natural resources, but great progress. What do you think went right here in the case of Hong Kong?
Basically, you make tremendous efforts in the development of human resource wealth. That is to say, education has been emphasized, and this is a general case in Asia, in Japan, in the Four Little Dragons of Asia. Education helps to produce disciplined, hardworking labor force, and through an appropriate economic development strategy, starting with labor-intensive, export-oriented industries. These territories, these examples, managed to develop quite well from the late 1950s up till today.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Joseph Cheng, for joining us from Hong Kong, and Mr. Robert Oulds for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.